credibility. If you come in and can be upfront and honest and say, actually in this application, I think this product over here that I don't represent would be better for you. That all of a sudden now you become a trusted advisor rather than a sales rep.
And I often say that we have all the requirements of space, right? Because it has to go underground and send us data from miles and miles away, and it has to work. Like, failure is not an option.
We'll put on, a standard mule shoe. Ours is slightly different just for that, but it's, everybody's got one.
The top drive and the drawworks really don't care whether the electrons coming at it are from a joystick or a PLC.
The panel, what you see here on the left, which is now controlled by one of my students, is showing you actually the control of our brakes.
As of now, geothermal is a pretty small market.
If you have tortuosity, the casing will be up against the side on part of the well. There won't be any cement there. The cement will have crested around it.
So managed pressure drilling, it's been defined as a process to precisely control the pressure profile in the wellbore.
The key is being transparent with our clients in this case. So tell them what happened. If we had a failure, tell them exactly what happened. Whether it's our fault, whether it's whatever the issue was, we need to be transparent.
But I think it's very important for everyone in the industry to know what's out there and kind of what's happening downhole as well.
I've probably worked on over 40 different performance limiters in my career. If I miss any of those and the computer is raising weight on bit and I miss any of those, I have a train wreck. The computer's going in the ocean.
Here's your new colors, here's your new thing. We won't do that
at all. Here's the tattoo you need to get.
Yeah, here's the tattoo. Sorry about the last one. We used to fake that all the time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vito Locksmith Show, where we are unlocking the secrets to success in the oil and gas industry. One interview, one technical presentation, and definitely one technical screw up at a time. So happy that you guys are all here with us for it's not a comeback. It's not a comeback. We're just getting this thing fired back up again. It is the Comeback Show. So happy you guys are here with me. We're going to start doing this again on a regular basis. We've already got some amazing guests lined up for us. We've got amazing guests that are going to be on here today. So if you are interested in the least about survey quality, survey management, what are the 3 qualifiers to a survey? And if somebody tells me it's temperature, I will kick you off the roof of my house. So yes, we're going to have an amazing show. Do me a favor, as Nico prompted me before the show. Let's do all of the social media things, like, share, subscribe. Yeah. Actually, the best things you can do if you're watching here on LinkedIn, if there's somebody out there that you think, or that you've maybe been having an argument with about surveys and survey quality and things of that nature, tag them in the comment section. Bring them over here because they'll get a notification to come over and watch it, whether it's now and when we're live or after the fact, and they can come in and they can fast forward to all the good parts when Nico and Mark come on. So yeah, just tag somebody in the comments, share it, stuff like that. Also, a new feature that's on LinkedIn, since it's not quite new, but it's new since we're firing the show back up. If you want to be able to get notifications for any of the content that I'm putting out, and or specifically for the show, just go over to my profile and there's like a little bell or something on there. You can go click, and then you'll get notified when I'm putting content out there. Specifically, the big reminder is for the show, but it's Fridays at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. This is the Vito Locksmith Show slot. So just for those that you don't know, this was the first live show on LinkedIn in the oil and gas industry, in the energy business as a whole. This was the first. So it's just a little yay for me. All right, let's say hi to some people that are watching. Yeah, guys, let us know where you're watching from. Love to be able to give everybody a shout out. Mr. Lee, watching from Vietnam. We've got the international audience in here now. Here we go. Then we've got Andrew Quinlan, who says he's watching from the energy capital world, Houston, Texas. Keith Stelter watching from the Permian. Thanks for being here, sir. Do appreciate it. Brian Dugas watching from Bowbridge. Mr. John DeWart, who comes in as LinkedIn user. I don't know why. Still can't seem to figure that one out. Peter Eyre tuning in from Fife, Scotland. I don't. I'm an MWD hand. I don't know these things, right? Jacob J from India. We've got Salim, who's been on not on the show, but he was on the Rotary Steerable Forum last year. So I'm turning in from Algeria. Clinton Moss. Special thing to know, Clinton's going to be on the show next week. So that's next week's. Can I do it? Right there. That's next week's guest right there. So be sure to tune in at 10 a.m. next week. He's going to be on the show. Paul tuning in from Houston. Clinton from Conroe. Go figure. Conroe's like the MWD directional drilling capital. Stacy from Cameroon. Thank you for being here. Mohammed from Smarts from Irving, Texas. Those guys do some survey quality correction stuff. Is it Dallas or Dallas? We've been emailing each other back and forth. He was looking at some of the ERD stuff. Tuning in from Houston, Texas. Thank you for being here. Ken Webb from Lafayette. Mohammed from Iraq. All right. Did I get through all of them? All right. I did. Thank you guys also all for being here. I do appreciate it. Like I said, like, share, subscribe. See if y'all can, tag a friend, bring them over here. Any MWD field hands that you've worked with or that probably need to be a little bit more educated on MWD survey qualifications and things like that. Pretty much going to be covering a lot. I've seen the PowerPoint presentation. Why is that still clicked? There we go. I've seen the PowerPoint presentation, or at least I saw part of it. Mark is still probably fiddling with it right now, maybe capitalizing things. And it's a really, really, really good presentation that starts off with a lot of the basics, leads into more technical advanced topics, but the presentation, the way it goes through, leads you right into it. This is stuff that just about anybody should be able to understand. If you are a field hand, this is stuff that you should know by the end of the day, right? Because it's here, it's free, it's on the show. All right. Asker from Kazakhstan and Car from India. Thank you guys all for being here. All right. So here's what we're going to do. We'll play a little How It's Done clip because we're still looking for shows to be part of season 2 of How It's Done. For whatever reason, I've got to keep saying this. We're looking for more people to be a part of the show. So if you want to have your company be a part of the show, do it. Right after that, we'll be back with our guests. I absolutely get pumped every time I hear that. Love it so much. Mark, Nico, thank you both so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having us, David. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So here we go.
Thanks, Dave. That intro gets me so pumped up.
Yeah. Well, I'm good because, there's very few people in the world that are going to get pumped up about survey quality and survey management. And I'm happy that I get to share this experience with 2 other people who are going to get as pumped up about it as me, if not more, since I know that this is what you guys do on a daily basis, as opposed to I get to fake being an MWD person, right? You guys are actually dealing with it on the front lines and stuff. So I don't really have much of the intro unless you guys want to introduce yourselves. We can go each, Mark, we'll start with you. Give a quick intro for yourself, and then Nico, and then we'll jump into the presentation.
Yep. Hey, I'm Marc Willerth. I'm a technology development manager at Helmrich & Payne, formerly with a company called Magvar that H&P bought. Been doing survey quality my whole career pretty much, and excited to talk today about it. Also, membership chair of the ISCWSA. Everyone should join. There will be a link later on in the presentation. If you're interested in survey quality, it is the group to be talking with.
Yes.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah,
Nico Kaska, the wellbore positioning manager for H&P, previously also Circon and Magvar back in the day. Been doing this for about 6 years, studied physics before that. Community outreach chair for SP Denver. So if anybody's in the Denver area and wants to do any volunteering or community outreach, let me know.
Yeah, here's our ISCW
Yeah.
is a little visual plug. Yay. Okay. It's very important. I mean, if you're in this realm, you should be attending and or keeping up to date with what we're doing with that portion of the industry. All right. Let's see. Is it going to come up on the screen? There it is. All right. Mark, I'll let you take it away. For anybody that's watching, if you've never seen the show before, this is very informal, but technical at the same time. So if you have questions, you have thoughts, anything like that, fire them off. We're going to just go through all of it as Mark and Nico go through the presentation. So here we go.
Yeah, thanks. A little background on this. David had invited us out to talk because of a paper Nico and I wrote a few years ago that was kind of a very specific topic with MWD QC. And we'll go into that a little bit. But I wanted to start with some background on QC and also discussing maybe some larger issues and trends in our industry. Because one thing that has always fascinated me is how notoriously inefficient the oil field is at using experts. We require having an expert on hand on every site for everything we do, even if they only do work for a very short amount of time in the life of the well, just because if they're not there and the rig sits for a day or two, that's paid for that expert's year. I often like to poke fun at directional companies because of how they advertise their record wells and things like that. And I recently saw one that I couldn't help but chuckle at because they were bragging about the fact that they drilled a record lateral and didn't have to slide for over 24 hours. And if you think about that, that's them just telling their customer they didn't have to do anything for a day. It'd be like if my gym sent me a report and was like, hey, look at how much time you saved because you didn't come work out. Like I get it, but it's not necessarily the value proposition we should be pitching. At least in terms of efficiently using our expertise. But we're trying to get better. That's a nice thing. We are trying to get better. So a couple major trends that are moving us in the right direction are increasing remote monitoring. So instead of having an expert on every single location, we can have a remote expert who can monitor a number of locations and focus their attention on the ones that really need it. Ideally, we also have increased automation. If we can take what the expert would be doing, what they would be analyzing, and putting it into logic into a machine so we can just execute on it at any given time, then we can reduce the amount of experts we need for the volume of jobs we are executing on. So as we ramp up, as we scale up, we don't necessarily need to have as many experts on every site. But often these efforts run into some roadblocks because there are some challenges. First of all, a lot of what the expert is doing is monitoring, like trying to decide if a decision needs to be made. And if you haven't figured out a good way to alert that expert, they still have to look at all the same amount of data and do all the same amount of decision making just to decide if you need to make a decision. So remote monitoring itself doesn't necessarily make our experts more efficient. And if we try to reduce the amount of things those experts are monitoring and we don't have the right alerts or the right procedures in place, again, we run into that problem of if you don't have an expert and something bad happens, you've just blown away the cost of the expert by an unfortunate event. One unplanned sidetrack because you missed something just would have paid for that expert for a year. In the context of this paper Nico and I wrote, the monitoring task folks had is looking at survey quality. And expert intervention is when you need to take some measures for collision risk. So being alerted that there's a potential collision, you need to do additional steering. But before we get too far into that, I want to take a step back. And as a benefit for all of David's viewers, we're going to teach you how to get a second interview with David. So first thing we're going to do is get a second interview with David, and that is describing the 3 survey quality qualifiers. Or an interesting thing I like to talk about is why do we even have survey quality qualifiers? Because we don't have 3 because 3 is a good number. It's actually the reason we have 3 is a mathematical consequence of how we survey. So an MWD tool has 6 independent sensors, 3 accelerometers and 3 magnetometers. You don't need all of those sensors to orient the tool. An MWD tool, much like an airplane, has 3 degrees of freedom. In theory, you could orient it with just 3 sensors if you didn't care about anything else. But because we have 3 more sensors, we can make 3 additional calculations. And those calculations are things we already know. So the stuff we want to learn, our inclination, azimuth, and tool face, is half of what we calculate. Then we have a magnetic field strength, a gravitational strength, and a dip angle that we already know the answer to. And if those calculations are right, we assume our inclination, azimuth, and tool face are right. So this is the core idea of how we QC our surveys, because things like gravity, dip angles, field strength, those don't depend on where our MWD tool is pointing. Gravity is gravity is gravity. Magnetic field is magnetic field is magnetic field, with some asterisks depending on how we're drilling. But that's the core idea of why we can QC our surveys. I also want to get you all comfortable with a couple plots that we're going to see a lot of in this presentation. These are ways to visualize survey quality. The first plot here on the left is a typical QC plot over measured depth. So in this case, we'll have our total magnetic field versus measured depth. You can see what we measure and its difference from what we expect. So the error in our magnetic field relative to a tolerance line. So this monitors the trend as you drill a wellbore. On the right side, we have an error cross plot. So here you don't see the trend in measured depth, but you do see how the errors correlate with each other. So does the error in B total come with an error in dip? In this plot on the right, it's almost like throwing darts at a dartboard. A perfect survey is a bullseye. And the farther you are from the center, the more issues you have. So these plots are how we look at survey quality. And now we can talk about how survey quality is actually used when we detect an offset well. So in theory, the Earth's magnetic field is relatively stable on the timelines for which we drill wells. And if you pass an offset well that has some metal casing, you will see a spike in your quality measurements. And so where you have this flat trend, you'll have a sudden change in the flat trend. And so this graph, is what when you're an MWD hand in MWD school, they teach you is this is a signal you might see an offset well. You should alert someone. There's a problem. The reality of drilling gets a little trickier though. And when you're actually out in the field, there's often bigger problems. Your surveys might have already been failing QC. It's hard to know if there's actually a spike. If you were a night hand or a trainee who came on tower at 17,000 feet here, so on the left side of the graph, seeing those surveys that your senior hand had already been accepting, when do you wake them up? When are you going to call that remote operating center to tell them someone needs to take a look at it? When are you going to use your lifeline? Would you like to phone a friend? Are any of these spikes, are any of these needs concerns? The errors are kind of small relative to what you're already seeing. How do you make that judgment call? So the question is, how can we, remove the experts from intimate involvement in every part of the process, but still let us escalate to them? Ideally, we would want to build as much expert knowledge into those QC tolerances we have and have an automated system that can think like an MWD expert, but still actually bring in an MWD expert when we need him. So this is kind of our core challenge. It's our instance of a broader challenge facing the industry. We're lucky, though. In the MWD realm, there has been an incredible amount of analysis done on MWD errors by the ISCWSA and associated work groups. And they have what are called the MWD Error Models. They list out the error sources we expect to have, that have a meaningful impact on our survey measurements. We have magnitudes we expect them to be, survey distribution error magnitudes. We know how they'll impact our inclination, our azimuth, and all of our QC factors. And how they'll propagate throughout the well. So we can take this data and build it into a QC tolerance, with the added bonus that this error model is part of our risk management policy. The collision avoidance calculations you're doing are based around this error model. So QCing your survey around the error model means the whole process is going to work. So if we come back to this survey cross plot, we can talk about the evolution of tolerances. The most common way an MWD hand will see a tolerance is usually some flat delta that their company prescribes. For instance, your magnetic field needs to be within 500 nanoteslas. Your dip angle needs to be within half a degree. If it's inside, you're good. If it's outside, you're bad. That is simple, and it's better than nothing. But if you were to actually construct the tolerances based on what the error model says, you wouldn't have this rectangular shape. Just like your ellipse of uncertainty from the error model in your position is an ellipse, your error in survey QC should also be an ellipse. And you might have two surveys that are, equally far off the bullseye, but the direction from the center they are is important in determining how good or bad the survey is. So in this case, this green ellipse would represent a set of equally unexpected survey QC values. In some directions, we expect larger errors. In some directions, we expect smaller errors. This is mainly because we have drill string interference. But this envelope is a way of making sure that your survey that you take agrees with the error model. A really cool feature of this, if you actually calculate these envelopes based off of the error model, is that your QC parameters will incorporate everything you're already doing with the well correctly. So as you change angle, just like your positional ellipse of uncertainty will change its orientation and how it grows, these QC parameters will also change, because what is good for a survey at vertical is not the same for a survey at horizontal. Similarly, if you start applying survey corrections like infield referencing or multi-station analysis, you'll be using a tighter error model. You'll expect lower uncertainty in your survey. And with that lower positional uncertainty, you also need to enforce more stringent QC criteria. So a survey that might pass for a larger ellipse standard MWD survey would fail for a tighter ellipse corrected survey. And that's just baked into the process from this error model-based QC. So this is really cool. This helps us a lot. But we're still leaving some money on the table. You can actually go further than this, because there's additional information in the error model about how the surveys relate consecutively. And it turns out this is one of the big differences between, kind of how a senior MWD hand would look at QC versus someone who isn't as experienced. And that's that trends in surveys are often just as important as absolute deviations from reference. So the trends can be described through what are called the propagation modes in an error model. And after you've accepted a good survey, what you expect out of the next survey is a much smaller envelope. So in this case, if we accept one good survey here that's shifted, up and to the right from our reference, it's actually better to have our second survey have a similar error to that first survey than to have a second survey that perfectly matches our reference. Sometimes you'll hear MWD hands say this as, if you've had all of your surveys be bad and suddenly you have one or two good ones, that's a warning sign. That's actually a problem, because a change in the QC values can be just as bad as having a deviation in those QC values. From the context of escalating, so using these as an escalation criteria to an expert, this is also really convenient, because having a single distance, so how close you are to the edge of this ellipse is like a distance, that can be just one QC criteria you need to look at for escalation. So instead of having to look at 3 different graphs and decide if the data combining the 3 graphs is a problem, you can reduce it to one single criterion of, do we need to escalate? And I do want to make a point here. This is not to say the other 3 graphs aren't useful. A lot of important analysis can happen in those graphs. It's just that if you're thinking of a unskilled person evaluating this, or a non-expert looking at this data, trying to figure out if they need to talk to an expert, it's more important to have a check engine light than a detailed diagnostic. And that's where this escalation criteria can work. So in practice, what does this change look like? Again, let's imagine you're a trainee fresh out of MWD school. You go out to the rig and you see all of your gravity qualifiers coming in high. They come in, 1 to 2 millig's above what you would expect. Technically, from what you learned in school, this is failing. This is failing the criteria you would expect. But it turns out this is not uncommon. A common reason for this is if you take an MWD tool and you calibrate it in Houston. but you calibrate it assuming you have precisely 1G in the shop in Houston, you will be miscalibrating that tool because gravity in Houston is a couple parts per thousand weaker than standard gravity. So the trainee might think every tool is failing here. A senior hand who's been on many, many jobs knows this shift from the reference isn't that big of a problem as long as the surveys are flat. So what they would mentally do is say, okay, I get one weird survey. We'll see how the next survey goes. But if I build angle and I rotate the tool and I go through all these angles and my total acceleration is flat, my inclination measurement takes a ratio of all of my accelerometers. There's actually no survey error here. This is fine. What would be concerning is if suddenly our values went back to the correct gravity after we built 45 degrees in the curve. So this is kind of graphically what happens when you apply this conditional QC. We call it a marginal sigma. Let's go back to our initial example. When would you want to alert someone if you're the night hand who came on tower and you see all these data failing? When is it worth it to wake up your day hand? And it turns out that our marginal sigma distance, our marginal QC, is really effective at this. So your first survey fails horribly, and you get warned for that. The first value is like 30. But that's what your day hand did. He took care of that. You started accepting those surveys. And so if you come on tower at 17,000 feet, the errors you're seeing in your survey are at least consistent with the other surveys you've been taking. And there's no need to really escalate it or work with it until you get to this spike here later on. It might not be obvious, again, if you're new to the industry or if you haven't looked at a lot of data, or honestly, if you just don't have hours to stare at data as an MWD hand. But these spikes are different than the earlier spikes. The errors contained in these changes do not correlate with errors we expect in the error model. And this is the point you'd want to escalate it. And so in this particular case, that was where they had a close approach with an offset well. And this marginal conditional QC is able to detect that change, even in the presence of other large errors, like thousands of nanoteslas of drill string interference. So this is a case where it can be a very powerful detection tool that doesn't take a lot of training to understand. This is a tolerance you can quickly put into an automated system. And it works in other applications too. So here's a case where you don't have the huge shift from drill string interference, but you do have noisy MWD data. It could be from a hot spot on a collar creating a cross-axis bias or something like that. And us looking back into the past, with the benefit of hindsight, it's obvious that by the end of this graph, something has gone crazy and should be escalated. But again, if you're the night hand or you're the trainee, what's the point starting from left to right where you wake someone up or where you call a friend? Because in this case, they were sidetracking and they knew they were going around a fish. Every stand earlier that they can make sure they escalate it is important, because your sensor's 50 feet behind the bit. If you drill another 100 feet, that's another 150 foot of well that is going to be created. That's a lot of time you could just hit this fish and train wreck the well again. Having sidetrack number 2 is just like the twisting of the knife. And so in this case, with this marginal QC, you can get a very early warning. This spike in the middle that's circled might not be something you would think to alert someone if you're just looking at the standard QC values. You might wait 1 or 2 more stands before waking somebody up. So the early alert is like a huge benefit. And then as we think about, efficiently using expertise, just as important as bringing an expert in is knowing when the expert can leave. And so if you have noisy data because you're paralleling a well, you have an offset well you don't want to hit, when can you return to normal operations? If your data is noisy, if things aren't clear, it can be tough to know in real time what's the survey that's finally good. Here we have surveys that are all failing, and right at about, I think this is like 4,600 feet, they actually start passing QC. If you have 2 surveys in a row that pass QC, does that mean the expert can go away and you're safe? It turns out no. If you look at marginal sigma, it's not that your surveys were going to pass QC in the end. This is still an error that is outside of that trend. And so knowing the trend, knowing the way the errors propagate together, and having that built into an automated system, again, can be very powerful for enabling when an expert should be there. And so these are the examples from our paper, but this is not the only application for this type of QC. Another common case can be if you have a subtle MWD sensor fail. So not like a hard failure where you stop getting readings, but maybe a bias shifts. Determining that shift happens, sometimes it's just a small change in QC parameters, but it can be a meaningful change in how you do a survey correction or how your errors are going to propagate or things like that. And not only do you want to detect if a shift happens, you want to know if it's stable. If your bias shifts, but it doesn't change after that shift, you might be able to keep drilling. You might still have an okay survey. But if your surveys are suddenly going to become random and errant, you want to trip and replace that tool. Not necessarily a sensor thing, but solar storms are a random error that can be added into the surveys, that it can be hard to know when do you stop, when do you have to resurvey. And again, this marginal QC distance tells you when the error is so large, you are violating the expectations of your error model, and you should reconsider things. And then the last one, just because it's fairly common, and it's something I think is fun, just as an MWD hand who dealt with this a lot. You're drilling out of casing, you're sidetracking out of casing, your surveys are interfered, you know your early surveys are bad, you know by the time you TD the run, your surveys are good, but you have to pick out, when do you trust a survey? What's the final survey that you're going to say is a good survey? You can actually run this process in reverse. So you can start by, when you're doing this analysis, you can say, I know I accept the last 4 surveys. When is the first survey that actually had that new error from casing? And that helps you identify precisely which is the clean survey you would accept and consider good versus a poor survey. So these are all cases where expert analysis would be useful. You might not know, when you need an expert in advance. And so having the ability to bring them in at the right time is pretty important. If you're interested in learning more about some of these techniques, here's a couple SPE papers that cover, the cases we talked about. If you like matrix mathematics, the matrix math for marginal sigma is in another paper. And then even earlier, there's a large ISCWSA effort that covers some of the core background on error model-based QC. So the weighting functions for different survey errors, some additional tests you can perform. Those are all some good resources. Once again, I would like to plug the Society of Petroleum Engineers Wellbore Positioning Technical Section, which is also known as the Industry Steering Committee for Wellbore Surveying Accuracy, the ISCWSA. For SPE members, if this interests you, please join our technical section. Please check out the ISCWSA website. We also have 2 large gatherings a year where we meet and share ideas. That was the initial presentation I had. Time permitting, we have some other things we can discuss, but I think it'd be a good time to check out questions.
Let's go. Yeah, so guys, if y'all have any questions, please start firing off. I know Brian's got one here already, and then Ari already said, wow, never thought of applying sigma in my MWD days. Now I totally get what trend actually means technically. So there we go. Brian's question. So let's pop this one off. Is there a solve/substitution for BZHZ when there is in-string or interference from a fish/offset well to correct with marginal signal starts to cross the line?
So I think I'll answer this kind of more generally. The case of marginal sigma is meant to analyze your surveys to see if the errors that the error model expects are propagating in the ways the error model expects them and the magnitudes they expect. And if they're not, then we kind of use it as an alert. And the mitigation of those errors or the correction of the surveys or the other things that could happen, like the detailed analysis, like solving for a new BZ, solving for other sensors, for the context of this discussion, that's where we say you should probably bring in an expert to do that. And there are a lot of tools and a lot of techniques to do that. And that's not really the intent of this marginal sigma that's like for the non-expert user knowing when you want to bring in that expert.
Speaking of MWD experts or survey quality experts, the Angus Jameson's watching the show. He's actually been on the show before, so it's actually warms my heart just a little bit to see that. He says, also beneath platforms, the platform effect can go deeper, I guess, than that. The surface casing reaches. Great presentation. From y'all's coworker, Angus.
Yeah, thanks, Angus.
Put that on your annual review. Angus said, great presentation. There we go. Andrew asks, are tools calibrated in Houston calibrated to 1G or 0.994? Wouldn't companies know this?
Many do, some don't. There's a lot of MWD companies in the Houston area.
There are 53 different MWD service companies, not based in Houston, but that have taken surveys in the state of Texas over the last 12 months.
There you go.
So there is the number. All right. Marcus, I want to know who does Magvar's hair. Magvar is not a company anymore. It's just H&P. So
this looks like one for Nico.
I thought that was directed to you, Mark.
Well, I don't have any hair, so I can't answer that one. All right, so I know you guys got some other examples in the presentation, since we're not getting as many questions right now. But you guys, like, for everybody that's out there, like now's the time. You've got two experts, plus plenty of obviously great experts here in the comment section that are watching. So if you've got a question, now's the time to be able to fire it off. Don't feel embarrassed or whatever. If you slightly do, and you think that you're like, oh, I don't want to ask this question because everybody's gonna be able to see my name and where I'm from. Jump over to YouTube, jump over to Facebook. You got some random throwaway account over there. You can ask it there. We'll throw it up on the screen. You can be, like Taco Bell Dude 75 on the YouTube, and we can throw that one up there. All right. So Mr. Lee's got a question. Is there any specific requirement for sag correction for inclination in the deviated hole? I mean, there are any standard for this correction?
Do you want to go for that one, Nico? Or
yeah, I mean, so sag is something that's considered in the error model. In terms of specific requirements, it's all going to be included in this marginal sigma calculation, since it does take the entire error model into account. The thing with sag that's kind of interesting is that you don't see it on a QC plot. It's not something that you'll see on your accelerometers. Like your GZ sensor isn't going to act any differently. It's literally that your sensor is just pointed in a different direction than your hole is pointed. And so that's where this error gets a little bit tricky when we talk about quality control.
All right, next one's Brian again. It says, does GT change with depth?
Hopefully not. What's interesting about G-total, right? Like there's not a drill string interference. For our magnetometers, we have this drill string interference that we always expect, and that's an error that will change with changing orientation. If G-total changes with orientation, it's not like there's some gravity field that's being created by your BHA. In this case, it would actually be due to an error on your forward pointing sensor or your axial sensor as your inclination changes. So not necessarily depth, but as your inclination changes. In theory, if you go deep enough, your reference G-total that you would expect would also change, just like gravity at the top of Mount Everest is different than at the base of Mount Everest. So if you were referring to more of like the actual reference gravity, it changes a bit, yeah.
All right, another one here from Jacob J. Does the marginal QC model remain the same when we are drilling due east and due west?
Yeah, so the sigma QC and the marginal sigma QC take into account all of the information that's available in the error model. So that includes azimuth dependencies, and that includes station-to-station dependencies. One caveat there, though, that I will say is that it does require the errors you're looking at to be observable in QC. So like Nico was saying, sag is not going to be detected because there's not an observable QC. And one thing that can happen at times, like for instance, drilling horizontal east-west, is if the error you're really concerned about is no longer the dominant QC error. So drill string interference has a smaller impact going horizontal east-west. If you start your well going horizontal east-west and you only drill in a straight line, there's a chance you won't notice excessive drill string interference just because it's not observable. But if your error is observable in QC, then the marginal sigma calculation should account for it.
There we go. So, all right. Sorry, I joined a bit late. Maybe it's been covered. So if the marginal sigma is good, but the H is out anyway, that tool error code should be applied. MWD standard or Inc only.
Yep. So in this case, if you think about it holistically, the way the workflow would happen in this case is when you take your first couple surveys, your H would be out, and you would escalate to an expert. And they would analyze what kind of error you have and what procedure you should have going forward. And they would basically assign what tool code they're expecting at that point. For instance, if you can correct it with a correction, you might have a corrected tool code. And then the marginal QC would then be, as you are drilling along with this set of surveys that have previously been accepted by an expert, you would then re-escalate if it violates those assumptions. So if an expert has said you should be applying, for instance, let's say MWD plus axial correction. So say you're doing a short collar correction on the surveys because H was out. If you're still passing your QC marginally from that initial assessment, you would continue applying that axial corrected tool code. If previously you were applying an inclination only tool code, you would continue applying that. Though inclination only doesn't have a lot of QC associated with it, so at that point you would probably just be going for it.
All right. All right, thank you for your question. Here we go, another one. I love the question, guys. Keep firing these off. This is what we're here for. Why are there different field acceptance criteria, FACs, for different companies? Like some have fixed and some have dynamic. Shouldn't it be a standard? Ooh, standard. That's a strong word.
Yeah, I think we would all love standards, right? And I mean, just like we saw, right, in Marc's presentation, there's this evolution of FACs that's been happening where it started with a box, and then you consider covariance and turn it into an ellipse, and you consider the way these errors, like the expectation of the errors, and then you can have this marginal sigma FAC. I think when it comes to different companies, everybody's at a different point in that race. There's not a standard as far as I've seen. Believe me, I've talked with a lot of MWD companies and tried to explain this concept. And it can be a little bit difficult because if you're used to just kind of a red-green concept, then trying to explain these ambiguities of data quality can be a little bit challenging.
Yeah, a lot of this, I sometimes joke with folks, the answer to every question is either history or money. So why are there different standards for different companies? History, when did they set their standard? Who set the standard? Or money, because it'd be expensive to change the standard they have. I will say, to give a slight plug, this is something we presented to the ISCWSA a couple of years ago. Our single station sigma calculation for QC against an OWSG error model is available for free at fac.magvar.com. You can type in your survey, your reference values, your inclination azimuth. It will give you a sigma distance that's calculated. It will do that because from our perspective, we think that people should be able to QC their surveys. And if it could be something that alerts someone to a collision risk or something, like, we want to make that available.
Yeah, I think that one's been on there for quite some time, right?
Yeah, it's been up there.
Here, I'll share. Well, here, I'll let you, or the next point was here. Angus says it's more important to calibrate access to exact local gravity than it is to the level of the table. If the table was 5 degrees off vertical, the max G reading would only be out by 4 millig's. So Angus, once again, it's awesome having all these. I guess like I'm going to guess like half the audience today is just ISC-WSA members. And then I said, got it, thanks, good stuff. Brian with another question. Keep them coming, guys.
Yeah.
Does the marginal sigma use the raw 6-axis or the corrected 6-axis after all the corrections have been applied? And while you guys are answering that one, I'm going to find this.
Both. So the nice thing with marginal QC is that any set of 6-axis data can be used. It's just that you would apply the appropriate error model to it as well. So it can be used to tell you if your corrections are actually passing the assumption of the corrections you're applying. We have a fun example. Well, I don't know if fun's the right word. We have an example that was actually an inspiration for some of the marginal QC stuff about an error that was still present in corrected surveys. And the corrected surveys passed nominal QC, but our analyst who's looking at it just knew they were wrong. And it turned out that the sensor had actually shifted in a way that wasn't in the error model, and it was a subtle error that wasn't accounted for in the error model. And when we actually ran it through the marginal QC, it caught it, flagged it. I can see if I can.
So real quick, I want to show this at to stream.
Oh yeah,
here we go.
That one.
So this is on the fac.magvar.com website. So you can come in here, put in when the survey date took place, latitude, longitude, put in all your information, and then you can calculate and get your variation of results, your sigma distance, AC sigma, total G total. So this is all there, right? No reason why not to. And survey quality, survey validation API. There's an API for it.
If you don't want to go to the website, yeah, there is a REST endpoint.
Right. So I mean, there's tons of great stuff here. This actually isn't the field acceptance criteria. That was 2014.
Yes, Long Beach.
Long Beach, Stephen Moss, who did the presentation about it. That was the very first ISC-WSA event that I went to, and it absolutely blew my mind when Stefan got done with that presentation. So that was phenomenal. I remember walking up right to him afterwards, and I was like, "You mean now I have to tell my field hands to change the FAC as they're drilling the well, not just guess at the beginning?" There we go. Okay. LinkedIn user, this is actually Mr. John DeWart. So 2 types of surveys using different physics. Magnetic gyro provides significant insights to errors that may not be observed in either survey alone. Do you recommend both types of surveying in long laterals or rely solely on magnetics for the final wellbore position used by subsurface for modeling? John DeWart, who's also been on the show too.
Mark, I'll start this and you can add to
go for it.
But I think it's very dependent on, one, the goals you're trying to achieve, and then the direction that you're drilling and kind of the drilling program. So if you're drilling a single run well, a monobore going straight north, magnetic surveying is going to give you a pretty good result. If you're drilling, 17 runs and you're drilling east-west and you're tripping in these lateral runs and maybe your case to landing point. And so a lot of these standard operating procedures while drilling east-west can't be achieved, then that might be a really good time to run a high-angle gyro. If you have a lot of offset wells, that's a really good time to run a high-angle gyro, because, with marginal sigma, you might be able to tell when you're getting close to a well, when you might have a close approach, but actually solving for that position at that point can be really difficult without, some higher level procedures that might cost even more money than running a gyro. I guess another benefit would be that running an MWD tool in real time and kind of while drilling is quite nice versus running a gyro in real time. And so that combination of the two oftentimes is really beneficial. Not only that, then you can look at the quality control to both, compare them, see if there's a drift on one side or the other, and so forth. So I think it's very situational.
Yeah.
All right.
I think Nico nailed it. The one thing I would say is I would recommend your company put a cost on uncertainty. How much value does improving the certainty of your well provide? If you have a specific lateral spacing intended, what's the cost if that's wrong? And that should decide whether or not you want to run a gyro as well.
There you go. All right. So to Angus's statement earlier, it's not supposed to be access. It's supposed to be excels. So he says, sorry, not access, excels, autocorrection. And then he tells us autocorrection changes my name to anus. So if you have met Angus in person, he's probably one of the funniest people in our industry, hands down, best presenter without a doubt, industry-wide. So back to what he was saying, it's more important to calibrate excels to exact local gravity than it is to level the table. If the table was 5 degrees off vertical, the max G reading would only be out by 4 millig's. So there we go. Okay. We got another question here. Not want to skip over anybody. Why some companies apply sag correction for the inclination and magnetic correction for azimuth, and some do not? Is any specific requirement for survey quality control?
I'd say again, it kind of runs back to what are the goals for any specific well. I mean, if we're worried about TVD and landing, maybe in a certain strata or somewhere, I mean, it can be worth applying any correction that will help that inclination and ultimately change your TVD. Sag correction being a very easy one to apply. MagCore, for example, it's a type of axial correction, so there's a lot of different names for it. Drilling north-south, a lot of times, these axial corrections are great. It'll put you in a proper position, namely because a lot of the cross-axial errors tend to wash out over the course of a long lateral. So you can essentially assume that a lot of those errors are concentrated on your forward or axial sensor. But again, this is just kind of company by company, need by need, whatever the necessity is, there's ways to reduce error, and then there's appropriate times to apply these corrections. For example, axial corrections, drilling east-west, that's a big no-no. We don't want to do that ever, but we see it happen time after time, just because standard operating procedures really aren't always being respected. So yeah. Oh, and then is there any specific requirement for survey quality control? Like how Mark was talking in his presentation, each of these extra aspects that we add to the tool code has some sort of requirement associated with it, whether it's using data from a certain place, like in-field referencing, getting that high resolution geomagnetic data, or whether it's an entire, process change, like multi-station analysis, you got to get those surveys corrected, or MagCore, you have to run it through the algorithm as well. So there are requirements for pretty much every extra little acronym you add to your tool code.
Love adding the acronyms. All right. Jim Tal says, any thoughts on reprocessing existing 6-axis survey data?
Yeah, I love it.
For future well planning. I don't know if that's like if we're putting these in there together or if it's just one question. Let me know.
Well, what we see a lot of times are people going back to these existing pads and trying to infill these pads, but these surveys were taken, 15 years ago, and it's really difficult to qualify how good those surveys actually are. So if we're lucky enough to still have on record those sensor values, the 6-axis data, the accelerometers and magnetometers, and we can reprocess those surveys, then you're effectively reducing the area that you'd be allocating to a certain well and then freeing it up for other wells to infill that pad. And so I think that, that's obviously not the only reason you would reprocess existing 6-axis data, but it's a really useful one that we see quite a lot.
If you see any wells that were drilled by Childress directional drilling, just
I just won't respond to that email, huh?
Just tell them the price is going to be triple. Just saying. Not too well. All right, guys. I know y'all had one other thing that y'all wanted to add in here. So if anybody else, if y'all do have some questions, be sure to throw them out. And then I'll throw this up here on the screen for you guys to kind of chat about.
This was coming back to that idea about the corrected versus raw surveys. And so this was actually a survey set from some number of years ago. We'll try not to label it. But when we were doing this kind of research, where these corrected surveys technically passed QC, 90% of the time or more. But the person who was looking at the surveys just said, this looks wrong. Like, you look at 1,000 survey sets, that this is not what it should look like. And when we did a deeper dive, you see that if you looked at the QC against a tool face value, there's definitely something going on. And this error actually corresponds to two sensors not being orthogonal to each other, which is not an error that is explicitly called out in the error model. And so that would not be something that is actively QC'd, so to speak. But what does happen is when you apply the marginal QC test, the fact that error is showing up in a way that is different than a bias or a scale factor means that it would have been flagged almost immediately and consistently throughout the run. So this was an easy way for someone who is maybe not familiar with an error to just say, hey, something's wrong and someone needs to look at it. Because while that one did get escalated, we had conversations like, what if a different person is on tower and doesn't have that gut feel? What if things are slightly different? We might not catch it. Because that error actually moved the well, I want to say 50 feet, which is a non-trivial number in many cases. But
I could push you outside. So let me get this straight. The sensors on the MWD tool were not orthogonal.
They were not 90 degrees from each other, correct. And it was because of shock. Like shock and vibration might have caused one sensor to move a little bit. And it's also a tricky error to correct because it's easy to detect that two sensors aren't 90 degrees from each other. It's really hard to know which one moved. Like I know that X and Y are only 89 degrees apart, but I could move either of those sensors to fix it. And so we actually talked to the manufacturer to get a calibration record so that we could apply the correct correction.
Wow. Whoever manufactured those tools, I bet that was a eye-opening experience for them. All right.
Well, they manufactured them fine. It was the field hand who didn't send them back for 4 years and drilled on them.
I've been a part of one of those organizations. Yes, the tools do have to be recalibrated, you guys. Yeah. You can't just keep using them. Or you can. I mean, actually, there's no rules against it, but like if you want to be able to maintain quality and things of this nature, yeah. So, all right. Jump back. Clinton Moss is going to be on the show next week, so be sure to tune in. I second Nico's statement. I've drilled north applying 3 degrees azimuth correction per survey for 1,500 meters and passed by a vertical well within 0.5 meters of intended separation as confirmed with ranging. They do ranging, right? I've seen the opposite performance when drilling east-west. Can you guys summarize the difficulty with correcting east-west surveys for drill string interference? Great question. This is definitely something that comes up a lot that people do need to be able to understand correcting for east and west.
So, I mean, I can give this a shot because there's a lot of analogies I like to use depending on which part of the country I'm currently in. I think a good one is basically like kicking a beach ball in a crosswind. If you kick it in the direction of the wind, that ball is still going to go straight. It might go a little bit further or shorter, but if you're in the direction of that wind, it's going to go straight. If you kick that beach ball perpendicular to the wind, it's going to deviate one way or the other. If you know how strong the wind is, you might be able to take that into account and kick a little bit against the wind so that that ball ends up straight in front of you. But in this case, that wind is the magnetic field. And so if you're drilling north-south, you're aligned with that wind or magnetic field. And so there's not going to be much deviation to your actual well's final location. If you're drilling crosswind, which is east-west or perpendicular to that magnetic field, in that case, you're going to get a pull or a push one direction or the other. And so what's really important when correcting these east and west laterals is getting some data in the vertical or the curve before those lateral runs so that we can effectively understand the speed of that wind and we can kick that beach ball in the right direction, effectively correcting for drill string in our BHA while drilling. I think, yeah, for California, that's a decent analogy, I suppose.
Yeah, that's where Clinton's base is, out in California, so it's perfect. All right, I know that we're covering a lot of like I don't want to say basics, right, or fundamental things, but these are, you know, they are a little bit more advanced topics. So, Pushkar, thank you so much for asking this one, because I do believe there are a lot of people out there who don't understand this. So, how is MSA done? What's the procedure? And MSA means multi-station analysis. It's a, I'll let you guys answer this, not me. I don't need to.
Do you want to go for it, or should I?
Yeah, I mean, on a really high level, MSA is taking not just a single survey, it's taking a collection of surveys. So you need a somewhat comprehensive data set. And you're trying to remove systematic errors, so errors that are present in each survey time after time, in order to essentially meet, like Mark was saying in his presentation, these values that we already know. We can measure these values. We're not getting them on the surveys, but after 4, 5, 6, 20 surveys, you can see these errors popping up on the sensors time after time. Removing those errors, recalculating the angles of orientation, so inclination, azimuth, those will then ultimately be able to give us a better position. So that orientation correction gives us a better position. But yeah, big picture, it's just fixing the systematic errors that are present on the MWD sensors. Yeah, I don't know if we want to go deeper than that, Mark.
So some like baseline assumptions are that you have these QC values that exist outside of your tool. So they should not be changing with your orientation. Like if you rotate tool face, gravity does not change. But if you see changes in your measurements in gravity as you rotate tool face, you can map that to potential errors that are expected to be in the survey. And so you can try to quantify and remove those by using those trends and comparing them to other things that have changed, like your tool's orientation.
There we go. All right, Mark, I saw you changed the president. You got another one you want to throw up?
Well, I was just going to say this. When Nico was describing some of the stuff about MSA, like looking at a QC plot can help show like what MSA would see. Do you want to talk through this, Nico?
Yeah, I can try to talk through this a little bit. This brings me back. Yeah, so I mean, it is really interesting just looking at quality control plots. For example, the big thing that jumps out right off the bat, you see kind of 3 regimes in this data. You see, in that total magnetic field, the B total in the top plot starts up really high, then drops down and then levels off again. That's a really good indication of something like, hey, that's a vertical and that's a curve and that's a lateral. We see that same kind of change in the magnetic dip angle. Like I mentioned earlier, we're very lucky we don't see too much change in the gravity field, except that once it reaches lateral, then we see these little spikes. Those little spikes are going to be very indicative of something like a cross-axial error, most likely a cross-axial bias on your accelerometers. You can actually also tell what inclination we're at different points. For example, when the dip angle plot there crosses that reference, we know that we're right within the plane of our dip angle. So that would be most likely the complement of our dip angle, since inclination and dipper have different zero references.
Dip angle is 66 degrees here, if folks can't see, or 66.7.
Yeah, I can't see that.
So an inclination of about 23, 24 degrees.
I tried to zoom it in as much as I can. So.
No, you're good. You're good.
Another thing we can see, the B total plot seems to be very.
Or Mark, can you try to zoom in on your PowerPoint? Would it do it?
I don't know if I'm that skilled at PowerPoint.
Control
plus, maybe. Oh, look at that!
Nice.
Well, there we go.
Oh, wow.
Look at that. Vidor
Learn
Locksmith
something
show in high definition.
But so, I mean, big
So
picture,
now we've
there's
totally
a lot
knocked
that we can
Nico off his
glean.
train of thought.
Yeah, I was gonna say Nico's totally doing it.
There's a lot that can be gleaned from these plots just by looking at them without even correcting them or anything, you know. And I think that's what is really interesting about magnetic surveying, is that there's just so much that's kind of hidden in these little intricacies. Probably going somewhat close to east-west, just because in the lateral our total magnetic field is very stable, not much deviation from our reference, which if there was a large drill string interference, which I think there probably is based on that vertical data, going north or south, we would expect larger offsets from that reference. I don't know, am I missing anything, Mark?
I did actually annotate the slide to see how Nico was going to do.
Okay, near east-west. Yeah, there we go.
And yeah, like Nico's saying, an interesting thing, because this has the dynamic FAC on there, so they're single station FAC, you can even do a little bit more quantification. So like Nico said, there's an accelerometer bias, but it's still in spec. I mean, no tool is perfect. So even though you see some noise, it's not a concern, but the drill string interference is probably a concern because it's out of spec.
The most important thing you just said in the entire presentation today, no tool is perfect.
There was a slide I almost put in the presentation today that said no survey is good, but some are good enough. And that's what your error model chooses. You know, is your survey good enough relative to your error model? But to bring it back, analysis of these kinds of trends is how you do multi-station analysis. Like looking at how these changes occur and how they're related to changes in your tool's orientation or other aspects of it.
Yeah, like Mark was saying, yeah, you don't want this. You don't want these changes in orientation, because it's not like if you're just drilling down versus laterally, your magnetic field did not change. It's just the way that your sensors are reading that magnetic field. And so the whole like, you know, game of MSA is just flattening that data on that center line and making it as flat as possible. And then we know that we've reached our expected accuracy. I don't know. Yeah, at that point, then MSA gives us a smaller uncertainty.
We've gotten to good enough.
You've gotten to good
enough.
Other classic quote that I've gotten from Mark is the line on the wall plot is exactly where your well is not at. I'm pretty sure that was said at one of the ISCWSA meetings, or I can bet you 1,000 to 1 that's not where it is.
Once upon a time, I'd have to dig it up. I did the math on like a typical North American well. I assumed like a 1 foot diameter to make it easy, but for any well that's like greater than 10,000 feet deep, if you drilled 10,000 of those wells, there's a strong chance none of them are actually have the whole volume on the line. So yeah, that's exactly where the well's not.
So, all right, guys, y'all got any more presentation stuff that y'all want to share? Or did we go through all of it? All right, excellent. Well, for everybody out there that's watching, thank you guys so much for watching and taking part in this. I would ask, for anybody that's still watching, let me know who you guys would like to be able to see on the show. If there's any companies that you would like to be able to see present and talk about something. If there are any specific people that you would like to have interviewed, or any specific topics that you guys would like to have covered, please let me know. I'm more than happy to be able to, do what I can to be able to be a servant to the industry. That's what this show's about. Finally, I'm glad to be able to get back into doing this. I've cleared my schedule some of the other stupid stuff that I was doing. And so hopefully, we can keep doing the Vidor Locksmith show, 10 a.m. Central Standard Time every Friday. Nico, Mark, thank both of you guys so much for taking time out of y'all's day to be able to do y'all's survey quality talk here on the show with an audience, and everybody saying, thanks, interesting presentation. John DeWart already said, thank you guys, really great stuff, great show. Ryan saying great. means a lot to me. It really, really means a lot to me to have so many people out there watching and big fans of the show. So please do me a favor, like, share, subscribe, do all those things. Because now when I invite, because of the amount of time it's taken to be able to do the show, now when I invite people on, they ask me, what are my numbers? They're like, well, what are your numbers? You know, what kind of views are you getting? So I now have to compete with all of the other people who want to do shows. Guys, please, please, please. The least you can do is just hit the like button, share it, or just, you don't even have to type in a comment. Just type in letters, and then the numbers just start going up. So that makes it makes a difference. I know how to game the system. I could probably do this myself, but I'm trying not to do that just yet. So once again, Nico, Mark, thank you to you guys. Thank you to H&P for paying you guys while you're doing this. I really do appreciate it. Everybody else that's out there watching, everybody saying thanks. Great presentation. Want you guys to be able to see all of these that are coming in so that you guys know. Great presentation, great stuff. Great. Got a huge audience today that's still on. All right, guys. And as I always say, let me see if I can find this first because I'm out of practice here. Know your industry.